Okay, for the plotting data lab, we need to make 4 different plots. And so I've listed the plots that we need to make over here: the distance versus planet order, orbital period versus distance, a log plot of plot 2, and then temperature versus distance. So we're going to make all 4 of those plots here. And I'm doing this on a Mac. The instructions might be a little bit different if you're on a PC, and depending on which version of Excel you have, they always move things around a little bit. But you'll see the basic instructions for what to do here on a Mac. And if you're on a Mac, it should look exactly like this. And if you're not and you have a question about how do I do this, it's not looking exactly the same, just send me a message and I will show you how to do it. Okay, so I've put the data that we need to use here. So we have the planets, then their order from the sun, distance in kilometers, distance in astronomical units, period measured in years, and temperature in degrees Kelvin. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is a distance versus planet order plot. And so one thing to know, by default in Excel, the column that's on the left, so when you highlight columns of data to make a plot, the column that's on the left is the x-axis, and the column that's on the right will be the y-axis. So if I just take the data here, and I'll include the headings. You don't need to, but I'll include the headings here. And then I want to insert a scatter plot. So the insert menu brings up all of this here, and then there's a region where you'll have charts. Now, in the PC version, it'll look a little bit different, but basically the same stuff will be in the insert menu. And you'll have a box where you can choose the different charts, and they use these symbols to indicate the different types of charts that you can make. We're going to be making scatter plots, and so we're always going to use this one, the XY scatter. And of these choices here, we're not going to choose one of the ones with the lines already drawn in. They're basically the same, except for each one they make specific assumptions about how you want the graph to look. So here there's no lines connecting the dots. Here they draw nice smooth lines connecting the dots. Here they draw the smooth lines but not the dots. Here they connect them with straight lines, and then here the straight lines without the dots. Unless you're told otherwise, I would just always do it without any of the added lines in there. So we're going to pick the scatter plot here. And so we have plot 1 looks like this. So see, it put the column that's on the left, it chose to be the x-axis. The column that's on the right, which was distance, becomes the y-axis. Now you can do a bunch of formatting things here. There's a lot you could do formatting wise. I'm just going to focus on getting the graphs made in enough detail to get the x and y axes to look appropriate. So one thing that you'll want to do is add axis labels to graphs so you know what's being plotted on each one. And so here we go to the chart design tab, and under the chart design tab there's a box for add chart element, and here you can add whichever elements you want. And we're looking for axis titles, we can add axis titles. And so if I pick my primary axis, I can highlight this, and then this is the order from the sun, and then we want to add vertical. This is the distance from the sun, and it's measured in kilometers. So in parentheses, I'll put the units of measurement. There's no units of measurement here. We're just counting order from the sun, so that's not needed on the y-axis for that one. Okay, plot 1 is done. I can change the title. What Excel will do when you highlight the data like I did here and make the graph, it knows this is X, this is Y, and then it chooses the Y variable name to be the title of the plot. You can obviously change that to be whatever you want, or if you have axis titles labeled, you can just delete that, and then it's obvious you're plotting distance from the sun versus the order from the sun. Okay, so that's plot 1. Plot 2, following a similar procedure, exactly the same procedure except for one difference, and that's that we want orbital period and distance instead of distance and planet order. So we don't want these two columns, we want this column and this column. Okay, we want this column and this column. And they're not adjacent, so I can't just highlight them like this. So what you can do is highlight the first column and then hold down on the Mac, it would be the Command or the Apple key, and then the next column. On the PC, I believe it's the Control key. You can hold down the Control key and then highlight a non-adjacent column. But once you have those two columns highlighted, the process is exactly the same. Insert, scatter plot, and there we go. On the x-axis we have the distance, on the y-axis we have the period, and then it labeled it as period because that's the y variable. And then I would do the same thing to add the axes titles on there as well. Okay. What you don't get to see very well on this plot is the data that's down in the bottom corner. It's all crunched together. And so what we want to do is spread that out by changing to a log scale. So if we look at the instructions and here, what it's asking us to do. Not plot 2, plot 3. We need to go from a linear scale to a log scale, and that means the tick marks are going to be a multiple greater than the previous one, rather than just counting by a certain increment in amount. So instead of going like by 1 unit at a time, it's multiplying it by 10 or multiplying it by 2 or some number that you can choose. That's the difference between a logarithmic and a linear scale. So what we want to do is convert this. So I don't really care too much about saving this plot that I made. If you wanted to, you could copy and paste it somewhere else, and then we can just change the one that's here. But the axis that I want to stretch out first is the x-axis. So I've clicked on it, and then if I control click or possibly right click, you can bring up this menu. And in this menu, we have the option to format the axis. And now we have the format axis dialog. And one of the options here, so notice there's different menus within this menu. The one we want is for the logarithmic scale. And I can choose the base here, right? So this is base 10. If I wanted it to be base 5, then the units would be 5 times bigger rather than 10 times bigger. Okay, but we'll stick with 10. Now if I go over to the y-axis, click on that, now I'm formatting the y-axis. I can also make that a logarithmic scale. And now what we see is the data shows up as a straight line. Might look a little funny because what Excel does is it chooses the 0.11 to be the origin of the axes. And that's because on a logarithmic scale, you can't get to 0. So each tick mark is 10 times bigger or 10 times smaller. So you never actually get to 0 when you go smaller and smaller and smaller. So by default on a log plot, it will choose 1, 1. But it doesn't have to be. So you'll notice here, we're still in the format axis dialog. Horizontal axis crosses, and it's selecting an automatic value. We can pick that to be anything we want. So let's say we make it, the horizontal axis crosses at minus 0.1. That moves it to the bottom. And then I can click on the horizontal to decide where the vertical crosses, and maybe I want that one to cross over here at 1,000,000. And then I can change my bounds, which I'm plotting because there's no data over here on this side, and so I can start it at 1,000,000. Okay, and so it looks better. The data is more centered. I could probably do a little bit better if I started the axes here at 10 million rather than 1,000,000. But you get the idea. You can adjust the axes, where they cross, where the plot is confined to in the format axis dialog. Okay, so let's exit out of this. And we have one more plot to make, and that's the temperature versus distance. So not a lot new here. We want distance and temperature instead of distance and period. So I'll highlight distance, use the Apple or a command key, and then highlight temperature. And then insert another scatter plot here with the temperature data. Okay, let me make this a little bit bigger so we can see what's going on. Now, in general, what you observe in this is that with the distance from the sun, the temperature drops. But there's one data point up here that really kind of changes the way the graph appears, and that's this one right here, which corresponds to Venus. And Venus has an excessively high temperature compared to what you would expect. And I'll let you think about what that means and why that is, and we might talk more about that later. But the data is that the temperature of Venus is much higher than the trend. So what we're going to do in this part of the lab is make a trend line. So I just have one dot highlighted. Let me click out of the graph. Then I'll go back and click on one, and now it highlights all of them. Now either right click or control click, and we can add a trend line. And that trend line will be a best fit to the data that's present. And you can see that it slopes down as you expect. Temperature goes up. Distance goes up and temperature goes down. Now, when you insert this trend line, it will bring up the format trend line dialog, and you can choose to display the equation on the chart so you can see the equation that goes along with that line. And so potentially you could plug in any value of x, and x here represents the distance from the sun, and then use that formula to calculate what the temperature should be based on where this line is indicating. Okay, so that gives you some sense. If this trend here was followed, then Venus should be down here on the line, but it's obviously not, which tells you something different is going on there. Okay, I think those are all the tips and tricks that you need to make the graphs. Mainly it's selecting the data to insert a scatter plot, using the menus to edit the axes labels, adjusting the axes as needed, including making them a logarithmic scale, and then finally adding trend lines. Okay, so if there's any aspect of these you need more information on, just reach out to me and I'm happy to provide more instructional videos on using Excel.